I am looking forward to an orderly election tomorrow, which will eliminate the need for a violent bloodbath.
Can we focus on the positive? Yeah, guys. Firstly, it was mercifully brief. A decisive victory on the night, which I think we can all agree is definitely for the best. I don't think anyone could take another week of that shite. Also, turnout held up. Democracy is alive and well in the US of A. But most importantly, it was a huge success, right, for both parties. And arguably the Democrats were the real winners. Yeah, subversive hot takes. What a crazy upside down take. I wonder where he's going to go with this. I'll continue to watch the video. That's what it's all about, isn't it? Well, look at it this way, right? It was a completely win-win scenario for the Harris campaign because they managed to raise $1 billion, which, if their own publicity is to be believed, and why wouldn't it be, included a substantial number of small donations. And they did this with just a single campaign promise, which was that they were going to try to beat Donald Trump in the election. And that's impressive, right? That so many people donated to that campaign, supported that campaign, because normally if you are one of the two major parties in a two-party system, simply running in the election is generally a given rather than your entire offer to the electorate. So it was a pretty ingenious campaign by Harris. I mean, not Harris, but the people around it. Obviously, Harris didn't really do anything. Because normally, if you want to make loads of money and garner support from the electorate, you have to do tricky things like have policy proposals or conjure up some vision for the nation. You know, it's all rather tedious and can obviously lead to a number of difficulties if you win, because people will try to hold you to all those promises you've made or whatever. So it's a nightmare. But the Harris campaign, I mean, they were just on another level. They didn't need any of that crap, and they still received loads of money and loads of support. So they'll be pretty chuffed with that. And so they've really got to be thinking, you know, how do they replicate this going forward? Because I think they've found a great strategy for elections that will serve them well. Just, of course, as long as people don't figure out that's what they're doing and still really believe that the Democratic Party are very serious about wanting to govern America and change things and make things better for people. Obviously, they've got to keep the real strategy to themselves. But luckily for them, this channel doesn't get very many views, unless it's a video about Jimmy Savile. So be prepared for many, many more videos about Jimmy Savile, because that's what the algorithm wants. Blame YouTube. Also, normally, if you want to make loads of money in politics, you have to be at least competitive. But of course, competitiveness always runs the risk of you actually winning, which is not what you want, because let me tell you, governing is not actually the glamorous thing it's made out to be in Hollywood. It's not like it is in West Wing and Geostorm. Yeah, it's a slog. No, the best thing to do is to run a campaign where you promise absolutely nothing, so even in the unlikely event that you do win, you don't have to deliver on anything. You make loads of money during that campaign. You have no intention of winning, and you don't. And then you blame that loss on Russia and racists and fake news, and so none of your supporters blame you for what happened. Then you can go on to be, you know, a spokesperson for, I don't know, YouTube, for example, and talk about why the algorithm is always promoting Jimmy Savile content, why that's good. Now, a lot of people are saying that, you know, the NSA and CIA are very much against a Trump presidency, and they would never let the US descend into a dictatorship. But the problem with that is that the only way the NSA and CIA know how to stop anything from happening is by installing their own dictatorship. So one way or the other, I think we know where the US is heading. And, you know, maybe it's a good thing. I mean, why does the US install dictators around the world? The same reason the US does everything. It's to help people. Dictators bring stability. And I think we can all agree that democracy in the US has become increasingly destabilizing. So maybe it's time the US had a dictator, you know, just for a bit. These things tend to only last 50 or 60 years. And I mean, one of the problems with the US is that it's trapped in this 4-year cycle. And maybe they need a strong man or woman of color who can really get things done. I'm definitely looking forward to the CIA's attempt to counter Donald Trump's authoritarianism with their own. You'll suddenly start seeing these articles in the New York Times about this all-American guy called Juan Guaido. He's as American as apple pie. And apple pie is the most American thing there is because it's a sweet food stuff which you can also fuck. And it doesn't get more American than that. Have you seen the Juan Guaido rallies? They're massive, mate. And they go on for like 12 hours. He's even got his own dance, his own stupid dance that he does to George Michael's Outside for no apparent reason. And the stories, oh man, you've got the stories he tells. They're so good that they bear repeating every day. Like the story about the time he was watching Elon Musk's spaceship land and he was on the phone to a man, a very important man, one of the most important men in the country apparently. But despite always telling the story in mind-numbing detail and telling the story at every given opportunity, he never reveals who the man on the phone is.
I had the screen muted, no sound. I was talking to a very important man, happens to be here. And that very important guy, one of the most important people in, I would say, the country, actually.
Who is he? But yeah, I don't know why you wouldn't go for dictatorship at this point in the US, especially as it seems everyone's in agreement on what needs to be done there, because as usual, there was very little to distinguish the two candidates in this election. Much as Starmer's critique of the Tories was that the Tories couldn't do the things that the Tories were promising to do, but he, as part of a Labour government, would get them done. So was Harris's critique of Trump. Harris said she would build the wall, that bloody wall that everyone wants, but no one seems able to build. And she was quick to blame Trump for blocking the bipartisan border bill that would have provided more resources to border security. Because that's what it's all about. That's what everybody agrees on in the US. And to be perfectly honest, I think Trump's probably the better candidate for, kicking out immigrants and securing the border. I mean, Harris put a strong case, but I just fear she doesn't have the right people around her for that kind of thing. Whereas Trump definitely does. Also, throughout the completely ridiculously incessant coverage of the US presidential election that we've been subjected to for weeks here in the UK, I mean, it doesn't seem to matter how many people die in Spain. Throughout all of that, I didn't hear one mention of an actual policy position on abortion. Neither Trump or Harris seemed intent on doing anything about that. Both sides lied about the other being a threat to democracy, and both sides framed their opponents as stupid and insane, which I think is probably fairly accurate. But there has been a drip disintegration of the Democrats' framing of Trump. Starting all the way back in 2016, when Trump was heavily criticized for his anti-immigration stance and authoritarian threats to rival politicians. These were encapsulated, as I'm sure you'll remember, in the catchy chants of "build the wall and lock her up." However, since then, the former chant has become Democratic Party policy, and it has been the Democrats who have attempted to lock up Trump. Russiagate then, of course, turned out to be a load of bollocks, and then, in 2020, both Biden and Harris strongly warned against Trump's hastily produced vaccine that had foregone the usual safety measures, before mandating it themselves once they got into office. During the campaign, Trump was heavily criticized by Dems for pointing out that Harris was initially a DEI pick, even though this was widely agreed to be the case by both pro-Dem media and Dem party insiders at the time. On appointing Harris, Biden himself had said, "This morning, all across the nation, little girls woke up, especially little black and brown girls, who so often feel overlooked and undervalued in their communities. But today, just maybe, they're seeing themselves for the first time in a new way." Harris, who had been incredibly unpopular in the Democratic primaries and the first to drop out, was picked deliberately to appeal to minority voters and in particular black voters who had not turned out for Clinton in 2016. The reason why Harris would appeal to black voters more than, say, Biden himself was apparently so obvious that it wasn't even discussed. But, maybe it should have been. The problem for the Democratic Party, as with the Republican Party, is that neither reflect the ethnic diversity of the country they want to represent. And the reason for this is simple. It's the lower classes of American society that are diverse, and neither party represent those classes. But instead of even attempting to do so, the Dems address this glaring lack of diversity by taking one or two unqualified individuals and then thrusting them into top and highly visible roles. Now you could argue, I wouldn't argue this, but you could argue this, some people are saying that a white man for example Joe Biden, has to prove himself electorally in order to distinguish himself from the sea of other white men that exist at the top of the Democratic Party. While a black woman like Kamala Harris might just fail upwards. But if the Harris team really wanted to win this election, they could have, put forward a policy. Even just the one might have done it, to be honest. Something like free healthcare. I mean, I know it's a ridiculous notion, but let's, just as a thought experiment, humor me here. Now, if they'd done this, they might have lost a lot of support from the mainstream media, who receives a large amount of advertising revenue from healthcare companies. They might have lost a lot of support from some of their billionaire donors. But hey, these things are always risky, and they could have actually done some hard work, done some graft. It's not easy to actually try to do something political with the political campaign you're running. But there is the added incentive that you would not only have a reason to win the election, but you might even do so. Now, on a less positive note, the election result is a complete disaster for the environment, but that's not really an issue in American politics, so it's not really surprising. It's also a complete disaster for the US's number one sissy beta cuck client state, the UK, whose government, run by Keir Starmer, lent the Dems their election-winning motto, country before party. And in doing so, of course, clearly put party before country, having interfered in the election process of a foreign nation. The UK is both heavily entangled financially with the war in Ukraine, which is unsustainable without US support, and the UK is heavily reliant on imported gas from the US. And so we see the grovelling apologies begin immediately upon Trump's election. Doesn't it make you proud to be British? But wait, I thought Trump was a racist, fascist, sexist, warmongering, authoritarian despot. What is Keir Starmer's government doing? Why would Starmer support such a regime? Unless, of course, none of that stuff really matters and there's no such thing as Western values, it's all just a game of power and alliances. Or the Dems were lying to you about the threat of Trump so they could fleece you and run a campaign entirely based on fear rather than policies. Or maybe it's both of those things. It's probably both, isn't it? The last thing I'd say about this election is that if you have spent the last few years hysterically screaming about how a Trump second term will be the end of democracy and the beginning of World War III, etc., then you've got to ask yourself this, are you going to spend the next 4 years actively willing Trump to do all these things just so you can be proven right? Because take it from someone who spends their days laboriously editing together hate-filled videos about Keir Starmer. It's no life, right? Let me tell you, it's not worth it, mate. For all the latest Jimmy Savile related news, join the Jimmy Savile Patreon, where we're constantly talking about loads of Jimmy Savile content. There's nothing on there, but potentially loads of Jimmy Savile content could be on there in the future. Sign up today.